Was America ever an empire? Most Americans learn about the rise of the United States as a story of freedom, democracy, national growth. But in our vastly interdependent world, historians have also asked a different question, maybe a more important one. What happens when a nation expands its reach beyond just its borders? Professor Kramer's research examines how the United States became a global power, how Americans understood their role in the world, and how ideas about race, citizenship, and empire influence both domestic and international policies that shape our world today. Professor Kramer, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
To start off, what first drew you to studying American foreign relations and the history of empires? And what does that word, empire, actually mean to you historians?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think what drew me to studying U.S. empire was, you know, first a kind of broad interest in the U.S.'s interactions with the wider world. I think there are probably two main things that influenced me there, personally. One is a really important year that I spent after I graduated from college, living in Costa Rica and kind of working on a project that involved just talking to ordinary people about their health and medical practices, kind of working basically as a amateur medical anthropologist on a fellowship. And it was the first time I'd lived outside the country, and it was really fascinating for me to just encounter how people thought about the United States and how they related to it and how they related to me as a citizen of the United States. And all that really got me thinking a lot about all of these new perspectives on the United States that I had never had before, just as somebody growing up and living in a society. I think the other factor personally is probably that I'm the descendant of immigrants from Eastern Europe. And my grandpa and grandma on my dad's side were both immigrants, themselves, who came over in the 19 teens, Jewish immigrants from Poland. On the other side, my family went further back, to the late 19th century coming over. But I think, the just talking to my grandparents and just having that sense of them coming from a different world, um, I'm sure shaped my curiosity about all of the forces that exist out in the world that have shaped the United States and all the ways that the United States has shaped other parts of the world. So I think those things were kind of in the background. And then coming to graduate school, there was a scholarship that was emerging that was about looking at these questions about, how the US's encounters with and power in the wider world had shaped its identity, had shaped American culture and society. Um, an edited volume called Cultures of U.S. Imperialism, co-edited by Amy Kaplan and Donald Peace from 1992, had a big influence on me early in graduate school. And so I think combined with some of those personal questions, that emerging scholarship gave me a kind of intellectual vocabulary and a kind of, rationale, justification, like, oh, this is a serious thing that scholars are looking into. And so I think early in graduate school, that set me on a path to ask these kinds of questions.
And when you're talking about that vocabulary, does the word empire kind of fit in there? And when you talk about empires, what does that mean to you as opposed to what a student might think the word empire means?
Yeah. Well, um, so for me, empire has always been an important category in understanding the US's role in the world. Um, but that is intensely contested among historians and even more so, in American public life. And that has a lot to do with aspects of American political culture that, um, really at the foundations of American political thought is, a kind of body of political thinking, usually referred to as republicanism with a small r, not the political party, but the ideology that um, the United States was going to be a kind of contained, self-governing society of virtuous citizens who, in attending to the common good, would sustain the conditions for freedom within that community, and that self-governance would be given to those who had the moral and intellectual capacities to exercise that kind of self-government. Um, that was an intensely exclusionary ideology. It was predicated on the idea that only, property owning white men could be virtuous and could be rational. Um, but that idea was predicated on the idea that the virtuous republic would not become an empire. That one of the risks that republics faced was that they would try to extend their borders, they would try to seize populations and resources. That was going to require a lot of military power. Military power is, for Republicans, kind of virtuous to the extent that it defends the domain of freedom, right? And there's this masculinist part where you have to prove that you're a man in order to be a member of the Republic, and you can do that by fighting or being willing to fight. Um, but the idea that military power and the aggrandizement of military power poses this risk to freedom itself, because the military can always suppress dissent, can always, define enemies within. And so Republicans were very wary about, the risks that empire could pose. And so for most of U.S. history, it has been, I guess particularly, since about 1900, um, it's been quite controversial to call the United States an empire or saying that the U.S. has an empire, because you seem to be saying that the U.S. is violating its foundational doctrine and that it is becoming something unlike what it says it is and what it hopes to be, right? So this is a kind of attempt to do an end run around that Republican concern about empire, right? Is to say, um, no, in fact, we're reproducing ourselves across space, and we're creating more Republican citizens, and we're bringing more places and people into the Republic. And that proved to be a formula that could accommodate lots of people's concerns about empire. And importantly, there's a way that despite republicanism having this real ambivalence about empire, when you look at somebody like Thomas Jefferson and the Jeffersonians, their entire idea of what is going to allow people to be virtuous citizens, what's going to allow these white males to, exercise these virtues, it's land ownership, right? It's the fact that they are going to have their own means of production. And that's going to involve the violent seizure of land from native polities. And it's going to involve the enslavement of people of African descent. That's built into the formula. And Jefferson has this idea that as long as the country is expanding, you've got more land to redistribute to, impoverished white people, the republic can sustain itself. So on the
Yeah.
one hand, there's this concern about empire as jeopardizing Republican freedom. On the other hand, um, imperial land acquisition is kind of the fuel that is going to drive Republican freedom. So those are really the two dynamics that operate. But the result has been that Americans have been very hesitant to, refer to their country as an empire. It's largely been the vocabulary of social critics of the United States,
Yeah.
um, particularly on the political left. Um, I think one of the other reasons that Americans have been, by and large, very hesitant to use this language has to do with the ways that it is often used by the nation's opponents in global conflicts, right? So
Sure.
the U.S. will refer to other countries as empires when it's fighting them. Other countries will refer to the United States as an empire when they're fighting the United States. So it becomes a term of derision and kind of insult. Um, and one of the things that I think is unfortunate about that is that it made it difficult to access that concept for purposes of analysis. Um, as a scholar, was not particularly interested in polemics. I have done activism. I do activism, and I can put a signboard that has a punchy slogan on it, etc. We all do that, but
Yeah.
but when I'm doing scholarship, I want there to be analytical nuance and subtlety. And I think what I realized reading this early scholarship is that Empire was doing a lot more than just polemical work. Um, it was leading us to certain kinds of analysis that we needed to be able to have, and that was much harder. It wasn't impossible without a language of empire, but it was enabled by a language of empire. And so that was one of my goals was to say, look, in a post-Cold War moment, when we don't have to worry as much about, using this term and throwing it back and forth, across the Berlin Wall with the Soviet Union, can we reconsider, this as a tool, as an analytical tool? And so that's been a part of my effort as a scholar and the effort of many of my colleagues over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, and I kind of want to talk about that definition of empire because we talked about land ownership and the idea of extending borders. And I think we see a really interesting distinction between early 1800s and mid 1800s. Whereas the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, of course, there's fights with other Native American tribes, but there's no formal fight against a different nation. But then as we get to the 1850s, it's a Spanish American War, and now we're fighting against a different government. And my big idea is that the Spanish American War is never really spent too much time talking about it in class. We touched on it for maybe a week. It's taught as a relatively small event. How important do you think that war was in transforming America's role in the world as an empire?
Yeah, good. Well, let me start with the beginning of your question, and kind of thinking about, how it is that we define empire, because that's been as controversial as the question of whether we should even use the term at all to apply to the United States, right? And for much of U.S. history, empire has been defined as the seizure of territory and its incorporation into the U.S. state on a kind of juridically equal footing, right? So, Western settler colonialism in the 19th century would be exemplary of empire building. Um, um, by that definition, the U.S. Doesn't acquire a lot of territory in the 20th century.
Sure.
And so that led early on a lot of writers to sort of say, the U.S. is exceptional. Like, the British Empire is colonized huge parts of, Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And the French, right, have done the same. Japan and East Asia. These are places where you go, you conquer, you incorporate, territories, and this becomes essential to the economy and polity of your country. And people who kind of said, well, the U.S. took a different path. Well, on the one hand, that approach um, neglected and in a really horrible way the fact that first the U.S. did take territory. It took territory in Puerto Rico, in the Philippines, in Guam, in Hawaii. In the case of Hawaii, right, it becomes incorporated into a territory of the United States. Um, Eventually, becoming a state in the case of Puerto Rico, right? Still a colony in that formal sense of a place that is incorporated into the U.S. There's been a definition that is essentially saying for it to be an empire, you have to be incorporated into the polity, but you have to have your own accepted carve outs when it comes to rights, privileges, etc.
Yeah,
Right? By that definition, the US, isn't colonizing huge swaths of the globe, and running it as a differentiated and subordinated part that is internal to its own politics. The post 1898 colonies are essential. I wrote a book on one of them, dedicated about 10 years to, working on that. But for me, that has always represented too narrow a definition of empire.
sure.
Um, and so um, I've always, really thought about empire as being defined in terms of the relationship between two different dynamics. One is asymmetric power, right? So, essentially one country exercising, asymmetric power over some other place, some other people, right? And an element of integration. So bringing those places, those people, those resources into interaction with the colonizing country, right? So that idea that empire is about interactions that are asymmetric and that integrate places, people, and resources into asymmetric and hierarchical interactions with another place. Now, that's a much broader definition of empire.
Yeah.
Um, and, it has its own risks of sweeping everything in. And I recognize that. But given the enormous variety and intensity of ways the US is involved in building asymmetric interactions with other parts of the world that are integrated into American society in important ways, I feel like that definition is much more enabling intellectually. It kind of helps us understand a much broader array of phenomena than we would otherwise. So I'm willing to run some of those risks because that definition, sweeps in a lot of things that I think we would want to be in the picture that are closed out if we just think about territorial acquisition.
And when we talk about integration, does that always mean assimilation, or are there differences in what moments in U.S. history do you see of this?
Yeah, great question. So integration does not always include assimilation. It often involves differentiation, right? I mean, the classic examples would be those post 1898 colonies where the U.S. is integrating the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Guam into U.S. power, but it is differentiating the populations of those countries by saying, look, you can't become citizens of the United States, right? Or, the Constitution doesn't fully apply to your territory, right? And that being for intensely racist reasons, right? The idea that, self-governance can only happen among white people by white people, and the fear that colonial subjects would somehow quote contaminate that or undermine it. So the idea of we've got to extend our power, but in a way that does not risk compromising the kind of quote purity of the republic. So that would be an example where there's differentiation, right? Where you're not creating a kind of homogeneous, space within what's being integrated. Um, so now that said, there are aspects of empire that are assimilative, right? Whether it's the idea that um, people subject to the empire's power are going to speak the language, right? They're going to have education that makes them legible to the metropole, to the mother country. Um, um, uh, Most importantly, in the U.S. case, has been capitalism, has been the idea um, that other countries that the U.S. is involved in are going to have at the core of their political life the sanctity of private property, um, and create legal structures and political structures that stabilize private property, um, and the um, and the commodification of land, resources, uh, human labor, et cetera. That's been, in a way, I think, the one thread that runs through lots of different manifestations of U.S. empire. It's taken lots of different political forms, lots of different forms in terms of incorporation into the United States, semi-incorporation into the United States. But I think one through line that runs across those is this insistence on private property and the profit motive and commodification as being um, indispensable.
Yeah.
As being like the thing that defines order, that defines civilization, that defines freedom. So, yeah, and that has an assimilative dimension because, you've got to kind of align your institutions, you've got to make them more similar to the metropole's institutions in order to integrate at that level of political economy.
Yeah, and when people debate American political power today that extends beyond our nation's borders, are they still arguing over questions that emerged a century ago in the 1900s, or have we moved into a different time, a more kind of globalized economy where we're asking different questions in a different way?
Yeah. So I think we're asking some of the same questions. I think we're also asking different questions, or and in some cases we're asking the same questions but in different ways,
Sure.
because the meanings of those questions have changed. Um, you know, I think the question of how Americans think about the power that their country exercises in the world is, eminently worth study. In
Sure.
part because it has a lot of consequences for what the U.S. actually does in the world, right? The U.S. is not a functioning democracy at this point, and I think in many respects hasn't been for a long time. Um, but I think it's still worth studying, how Americans relate to the world beyond their borders, and that's going to inform the way they behave politically, whether they support wars, whether they don't support wars, even in a society that, by many metrics, is a kind of sub-democratic society. That's still important.
Yeah.
I do think the most important question to ask about U.S. empire is always about the impact on other people outside the United States. Beginning with Native Americans who are, initially outside the territorial borders of the United States, become conquered, incorporated subjects inside the United States, and then extending much more globally in the 20th century. So I think that is the most important question.
Sure.
But the question of how we think about this, in the United States, I think is really crucial. And I think it's played a much more important role in American identity than we've often given it credit for. When we think about what defines a nation, we think about, its popular culture, we think about its political institutions, we think about its food, we think about its music, right? But the idea that um, the way a country interacts with other states, whether it sees those states as equals or subordinates, right? Which countries it sees as its equals and subordinates,
Sure.
which peoples it lets into the country and doesn't let into the country, which places are okay to invade and not invade, right? All those things I think make their way into the core of a nation's identity. And I think Americans are not very aware of that process, um, for a lot of reasons, not least of which the fact that we don't use concepts like empire that would raise that awareness, right? If you're a British subject in the early 20th century, there's an empire out there because
Yeah.
everybody's telling you that all the time. So I think it's something that is really worth being much more curious about than we usually are. Um, in terms of how the questions have differed, I think one of the things that just strikes me when, the the epicenter of my research, my early research especially, was the Gilded Age and Progressive era. And you referenced the Spanish-Cuban American War, the Philippine-American War in and after 1898. And one of the things that I think strikes me, is that um, on the one hand, the um, the that war, as you referenced earlier on, I think plays a really important role. It's an inflection point in American foreign policy history. Um, in that it creates the kind of some of the infrastructure, particularly in Asia and the Pacific, for the U.S. to project military power,
Yeah.
um, et cetera. But I think one of the things that strikes me looking at the debate is, how fraught Americans are at the time about what this might mean for the freedom of American society. Now, that, as I mentioned, has a lot to do with racism, and the sense of like, well, if we go out there to conquer, then, quote, they will come back here and colonize us, right? So there's a lot of that nativist impulse there. But there is a lot of concern about militarism, about exploitation, about what happens to a country, um, when it makes the militarized conquest of other parts of the world and the exploitation of those resources a fundamental part of itself.
Yeah.
Now, of course, by this point, the U.S., has conquered North America on the backs of enslaved African Americans and indigenous people. So that idea of conquest and exploitation is not new. It's not absent from the United States before
Of course.
1898. But there really is a major debate in 1898 about, is this something that the US should be doing? And um, I ended up doing a research project that ended up coming out in the New Yorker magazine about the debate in around 1900 about the revelation that um, U.S. soldiers in the Philippines have been torturing Filipino prisoners using what we would now call waterboarding.
Yeah.
And there's a huge sort of tumult about that in the United States. And I think one of the things that has struck me across looking at the 20th century, the U.S. becomes much more involved in a great deal more power projection, a great deal more violence, um, uh, and and yet at the same time that the scale of violence has extended, the degree to which Americans debate it and deliberate about it, uh, I think overall has declined in a lot of respects. And I think this is, especially true since 9/11. I mean, I think there is a robust anti-imperial politics in the United States in the 20th century that, historians have done, a decent job so far kind of assembling pieces of. I think we need a lot more research. But I think particularly since 9/11, the space available in public for criticizing American foreign policy has really shrunk. Um, and in ways that I think are really dangerous. They're
Of
dangerous
course.
for the world. I think they're dangerous for, people who aspire to the U.S. being a more free and democratic society. Um, so, the fact that the U.S. can, supply weapons for many parts of the world, right, that are leading to the massacre of, civilian populations, most egregiously in Gaza in recent years.
Of course.
Um, and the fact that Americans can go about their day, right, and not think very much about it. And uh, to me, that says something powerful about American empire itself, right? That it's a different kind of empire. Um, if people are aware of it and debating it, deliberating about it, have some ability to actually stop it based on collective action, right? And it's a really different empire if it continues to do those things, but the polity decides to turn its back, right, on
Yeah.
what it is responsible for, right? Turning a blind eye to the things that it's actually bringing into the world. And that's worth historical study. And I think that's worth moral inquiry as well.
Yeah, and kind of on that, one final thought. If you had to leave younger audience with just one takeaway about power, empire, American history, what would it be?
Wow, that's a biggie.
The big one.
So, I think the question I would ask, and I think it's one that's implicit in a lot of my teaching, um, is there's a way that, living in the world's most powerful country still, and, one of the world's wealthiest countries, although also one of the world's, most unequal industrial democracies, um, it is very easy to take for granted the vast inequalities between the resources, the power, the life chances of human beings on Earth. There's a way that I think that just gets backdropped, right? And we're kind of trained to naturalize it in a lot of ways.
Sure.
And there's a lot of really ugly stuff that goes into naturalizing that, right? The sense that, well, you know, people who live in powerless, impoverished countries, they are, not modern. They are not, civilized. They don't have the stuff. They don't have the intelligence. They don't have the creativity. They don't have the virtue that people who live in the wealthy parts of the world have. And so, in a sense, they kind of deserve um, the unequal position that they have in the global order of things. That's that naturalized approach to global inequality. And I think, there always is very intense forms of racism, xenophobia, um, and other ideologies that go into making that something that people just walk around with and
Sure.
not ask questions about, right? And from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of a lot of historians, those inequalities are produced. They were produced by colonialism and neocolonialism. Those inequalities were produced, through the very process of the more powerful, industrialized, militarized parts of the world going out into the world, seizing resources, right? Disrupting African societies violently and seizing enormous populations to fuel sort of settler colonial capitalism in the West, right? Um, the seizure of, the resources of Central America to make banana plantations possible so that we have inexpensive bananas on our breakfast tables. Um, um, the projection of power in the Middle East, right? So that Americans can drive gas guzzling cars and take for granted that they're going to pay $3 a gallon for gas,
Yeah.
right? So those projections and the violence that go into them have generated a lot of those inequalities. And I think I would ask students, and I'm realizing this is a long question, you know, if you didn't take those global inequalities for granted as given or somehow natural, right? How would you go about explaining them, right? Um, and if you decided that you were not going to allow kind of racist and xenophobic ideas about differential human capacities shape your imagination, I would ask them to be curious about what kinds of things go into making the world as unequal a place as it is. And if you disallowed yourself a lot of really noxious modes of interpretation that have to do with people's inherently different human capabilities, what would be left? What would you and in that mix, I would want um, empire to be a really important conceptual tool. Wouldn't explain everything. And as a scholar, to me, having sophisticated multifactorial analysis is really important. But I think we can't understand the world we live in without understanding the process by which not just classic formal colonialism, but also late 20th century neocolonialism, the kind of extension of a lot of those um, kind of classic imperial forms of exploitation, but in the context of independent nation states. So that's really what's characterized global empire since, the mid 20th century. So I would want, empire to be an important part of our toolkit in making sense of that question. And the US as the paramount power in the world since World War II, although that's rapidly pivoting in a lot of respects, um, we would need the US to figure very prominently in that history. And I think the idea of US empire helps us ask those set of questions. So that would be what I would ask students to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point to leave off on. It's not just being critical, because of course being critical is a huge part of it, but it's also asking the questions, how are things today the way they are, and how will decisions that we make now impact the future? Because the world wasn't always how it is, and there's so many factors, so many individual instances that shape the world that we now live in today. And I think what you said about America playing a huge role in it, especially in the past, like America's a relatively young nation compared to others, but it's had a huge impact on the trajectory of the world, and I think examining that is super important.
Absolutely. I mean, you've just presented a great reason why we should study history, right?
Of
It's
course.
so easy to assume that we live in the world that we do because it was somehow destined to turn out this way. And a lot of what historians do, right, is to kind of not allow us that sense of a convenient kind of path that history is on, right? And
Yeah.
realizing all the contingencies, all the things that went into making the world the way it is. And from my own perspective, I want our approach to history to be a critical one that doesn't take the existing distributions of power in the world for granted and that asks how it was that they came about, and that is committed to a sophisticated, primary source based, rigorous account um, um, of what went into making the modern world, but to do it animated by a set of questions that are ultimately really ethical questions,
Yeah.
about how we live in and amongst each other in an interconnected world, and in a context where I think our starting point should be the equal dignity and worth of all human beings. And I think if you start off from that value proposition, it raises a whole set of critical questions that then the tools of history can help you explore and maybe even answer.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That's a great note to end off on.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.